Cool. So, hi everyone. So this talk is about psychological safety. Many of you would have heard this term before. If you have, you would know that it has something to do with trust. Maybe you don't know much more than that. I hope you leave today with a much better understanding. So, yes, Wednesday, last day of GCAP. It's after lunch, so I guess you're all, in a food coma and hoping for a nice kind of easy, touchy-feely, relaxing talk where you're all hearing what you want to hear. I'm hoping that won't happen. The theme is ambition, so I'm hoping to challenge you. Hence the slightly controversial title. So yeah, I'm hoping there should be plenty of time for questions at the end. So hopefully you'll have a chance to challenge me as well. I'm Dom. I work at Wargaming Sydney, where we are working on a new AAA vehicle combat game, which we're very excited about. Here's a screenshot. It's completely unrelated to the talk, but we've been working on it for a long time, and we're very excited about it. We haven't actually shown anyone, so it's I wanted to be able to show off. We are doing a. We are doing a public test at the moment. I did technically get the screenshot off Steam, so I think it's okay. So I'm development manager and director of engineering of the games unit in our studio. That's a complicated way of saying that I manage our development teams. So we've got about half a dozen development teams working on this game and a couple of small prototypes. I'm responsible for making sure that those teams are effective. Each of those teams owns a feature stream. We believe in very high team autonomy, and so it's very important that teams are candid, that they are open with each other when things go wrong. So a little bit about myself. I've been making games since I was in primary school, starting out making stuff in PowerPoint and then QBasic. Studied software engineering, but I started leading teams quite early on, and at the moment it's been most of my career now. I still love writing code and making games, but I found quite a while ago that I'm much more effective as a manager than I ever was as an engineer. Unfortunately, it took me a very long time to realize that I was a bad manager at the start, a couple of years. The thing is, nobody told me otherwise. The people who were working for me, whose performance reviews I was writing, never told me I was a bad manager, so I'm not quite sure why that was. It's an environment that's quite rife with Dunning-Kruger. And the thing that took me way too long to realize was that management and leadership is its own discipline. It's a completely different job. And in general, I think we don't train or prepare our emerging managers well enough. And so my personal mission has become to coach and train all the teams I work with, coach and train all the managers that I work with to make their teams healthy and effective. And so I spend a lot of my time mentoring leaders and growing managers. And so that brings me here today to talk about psychological safety. I believe that many people have a surface level understanding of what this is, but I also firmly believe that it's one of the most important tools in a leader's toolkit, and therefore I want to make sure that you're all able to make the most of it. So I want you to leave this talk with an understanding of why psychological safety is important, to understand how it's intertwined very closely with inclusivity, and how it makes it possible for us to make the most of diversity. I'm hoping that this will be a little bit of a different spin on these topics than you've heard before. I want you to leave with a deep understanding of psychological safety so that you can recognize when it's present or when it's not, and you can look at a particular practice and recognize whether it's helping or hindering it. I want you to leave with some methods to build it, some concrete things you can take away, and even some tools to measure it in a team. So to start with, I want to talk just very briefly about knowledge work. So this is the sign-up framework. It's developed in IBM a long time ago to aid in decision-making. Don't worry about the details. I'm not going to go deep into explaining it, but the point of showing it is just to illustrate that different problem domains require different approaches to solving them. The kind of work that we do in game dev tends to sit at the top, encompassing complicated and complex problems. And in this environment, while we need to draw on the expertise and good practices that we've built over a long time, complex is the realm of unknown unknowns. And so we also need to leverage new ideas, new approaches, look to emergent practices, and we need to run experiments. As an aside, this is an environment where an agile approach can really help a team to navigate. I also want to touch very briefly on VUCA, so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. This describes an environment where things change quickly, they lack predictability, cause and effect can be very difficult to ascertain, things can be misinterpreted and easily misunderstood. The term started out in the military, but it's now used to describe the organizational environment for knowledge work. So knowledge or creative work is what most of us do. It's where we primarily use our brains, not our bodies, in our work. And this is an environment where we tackle new problems, new situations, rather than repeating the same tasks over and over again. So not an operational role. And in this environment, we need not just our intellect, but we need to be able to tap into our creativity and our innovation. And those can be very shy beasts. So today I'm talking specifically about knowledge work that's done by teams of people, because that is where psychological safety becomes a critical piece of the puzzle. There is a lot to be said for creating an inclusive environment as the right thing to do, as being a good human. There is a lot of value in being fair, and there are great personal benefits for the people you're working with if you create a great environment for them. I'm going to be consciously avoiding that side of the argument because that would make this talk a lot longer. Instead, I'm going to focus a bit on a take that I haven't seen much before, which is about the business. So as leaders, we're responsible for getting the best outcomes for our organizations. And so this talk is from that perspective, trying to do right by the people, but ultimately optimizing for business outcomes. Now, in a VUCA environment, for businesses to be competitive, we need novel ideas and solutions for all the problems that we find, and that's problems at all levels, as well as the ability to experiment, fail, and learn from failures. So now I want to talk about how we can make our teams and companies succeed in a VUCA environment in knowledge work. And when you bring a diverse team to the table, that brings an extra dimension to the problem. And so that leads us to the business case for diversity. So if we start with a homogeneous team, the general idea here is that if a team is staffed with very similar people, the range of ideas and solutions that they bring to problems will be smaller and narrower. And so while communications might be very smooth, things will feel very easy, and there'll be very little conflict, you end up with groupthink. In a diverse team, on the other hand, in a heterogeneous group, you'll have broader and new ideas, perspectives, bring new mental models to the table. And these different ideas come from diversity of personalities, cultures, experiences, education, passions, different ways of thinking, different areas of expertise, and different beliefs. We look for this kind of diversity when we can, but it's extremely difficult to hire for these things. So we commonly use proxies to assist. We look for diversity of sex, race, nationality, age, neurodivergence, seniority. We end up with a bigger solution pool, and this in combination with the higher level of scrutiny that you tend to get with a diverse team means you find better solutions. Nice and easy. Well, at least that's the theory. More likely, you have a diverse team, but people don't raise their voice. People in a minority are much less likely to speak up. And so the team will still settle on those comfortable ideas, and mediocre ideas will win out. Or maybe you'll do a little bit better, and people will bring their new ideas to the table. They'll try it out. They'll show a bit of courage. But unorthodox ideas will get shut down. And you get the same mediocre ideas going forward. And so this results in the same level of groupthink. And if it happens too much, people will just stop raising their voice. And this is also one of the key reasons we get burnout, when people keep trying to do what they think is right, but hitting roadblocks. So back to the ideal scenario. Most of the time, this won't happen on its own. You can get very lucky, but generally it won't happen. If you build an inclusive environment, then this can happen. And that way you can allow healthy intellectual conflict to arise and to be resolved. So I want to talk a little bit about inclusivity. Inclusivity is usually spoken about in partnership with diversity. It's not talked about as much, but it is very, very important for business outcomes. Most people kind of understand how it works. If you can root out discrimination in hiring practices, you'll make sure that you're not missing out on the best talent. If people feel included and part of a community at work, they'll be happier, more engaged with their team and the work, and more productive. So I'm going to dig into this just a little bit further. In an inclusive environment, people feel treated with respect. They feel like they're part of a community. They feel a sense of belonging. And this results in them being willing to show some vulnerability, which means they'll bring some of their personality and creativity to the table. But this isn't just limited to the ideas people raise. It also means they'll raise dissenting opinions. They'll challenge the status quo. They'll share their mistakes. All of these things are needed for novel ideas to surface so that a creative team can pivot quickly and succeed. And this finally brings us to psychological safety. I know there's been a lot of preamble. The reason is that it's not a very straightforward term. There's a lot of complexity, and so it is important to kind of understand a lot of this context. So psychological safety, as I mentioned, is one of the key things that's needed for that ideal flowchart before to occur. There are many well-known studies that show the importance of psychological safety in building productive and high-performing teams. Gallup considers it absolutely critical for engagement. Patrick Lencioni identified it as the lack of it as the foundational dysfunction of a team in his very popular management fable. Google's Project Aristotle identified psychological safety as the most important dynamic of effective teams. This, by the way, is the research that was led by Amy Edmondson, who literally wrote the book on psychological safety. So it's good for the company and it's great for the people, but what exactly is it? Psychological safety describes an environment where members of a group have interpersonal trust in each other. That is, they have a belief that the other members of the group hold positive intentions towards them and will not use their words or mistakes against them or act against their interest. This means there's a feeling of acceptance, of respect. And it describes kind of a phenomenon of how people are viewed. And it tends to be a group phenomenon. So different members of the group will tend to feel there is the same degree of psychological safety. This is because it's a belief not about trust with one person, but about the groups and dynamics, the norms and dynamics of the group. So psychological safety is closely related to trust, but I guess the relationship is something like it's downstream from the sum of all the trusting relationships, if that makes sense. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions about psychological safety is that it is about being nice. And in many ways, it's the opposite. Being nice means, in a lot of situations, you'll avoid conflict. You'll keep your mouth shut instead of criticizing, instead of speaking up. And in a lot of ways, this is the opposite. Ideally, you want honest and direct feedback. This is kind of the idea in radical candor. So be direct, be clear, but make sure you care about the person at the same time. Okay, so that's what psychological safety is. I realize it's still a bit vague, so I think it will help to describe what it looks like, on the studio floor when it exists and when it doesn't. So, when psychological safety is missing, the big thing that you'll see is that people keep their mouths shut. There's a fear of judgment. It's always going to be easiest to avoid taking any kind of interpersonal risk, and usually this is a subconscious decision. People fear damaging relationships. They lack confidence. They focus on self-protection, and they want to avoid being seen in a bad light. They want to avoid upsetting the boss, and they don't want to be labeled as negative. And people don't want what they say or do to be used against them. This is a really big driver of behavior. And so we all, to some extent or another, invest effort in building a facade. We focus heavily on influencing others' perceptions of us in social interactions. Brené Brown uses a really great metaphor of putting on armor. You put it on to protect yourself, but wearing armor does weigh you down. It means you can't grow, you can't be comfortable. When there's no psychological safety, people are motivated by fear. And this can result in an illusion of meeting goals, as people optimize for the goals rather than the right thing. If the boss only wants to hear good news, then they won't hear the truth. People won't bring their passion and their creativity. And you end up with a culture of blame. Problems are attributed to people rather than process or the environment. And when this happens, people will just stop talking about problems. When bosses have all the answers and absolute authority, the rational thing for anyone to do is fear the boss and think very carefully about what they say. And this is how you can get toxic positivity. And when all of this happens, failures just aren't learned from because no one wants to talk about them. So, when there is psychological safety, so there's a good definition of courage that I quite like. People talk about courage is not about having no fear, it's about kind of accepting your fear and overcoming it. And in a similar way, even if there is a lot of psychological safety in a team, interpersonal risk never disappears. There is always some downside risk of showing vulnerability, putting yourself out there. But when there's psychological safety, people think less of the negative consequences of expressing something. Of expressing something new, something different, something unpopular or disruptive. And they'll speak up more. They'll challenge the status quo. This means dissenting opinions are put forth. The best ideas can succeed. People will be willing to be vulnerable, which means they'll bring more of themselves to work. They'll bring their personality, their creativity, all their ideas, which means you get more and better ideas, a larger solution pool. You also get team learning and knowledge sharing. These things shouldn't be taken for granted because they require taking interpersonal risk. And this enables a sense of inclusion and belonging, which we've already talked about, and that is completely necessary to benefit from diverse voices. So what does the research say will help you to build psychological safety in your team? So I see a few phones up. If you want to take a photo of any slide, make it this one. This is probably the most important one. But a few caveats before I get into it. There is no magic bullet that will boost productivity or engagement or psychological safety. Psychological safety is an aspect of team culture, and team culture can't be built directly. So for example, you can't forcibly extract ideas from quiet people. You can encourage your managers to ask questions of them, which means that more people will have an opportunity to raise their ideas, which means maybe they will, but you can't guarantee it. You also, for example, can't make people stop taking things personally. You can encourage criticism of ideas rather than people, and if you build this into your culture, then gradually people might open up and they might reduce the ego that they've got attached with their work, but you can't guarantee it. You can't even directly create any aspect of team culture, but you can boost the chances of a healthy culture coming about, of psychological safety happening. So leaders can create the necessary conditions which may help psychological safety to manifest. Trust is earned in many small moments over the long term, and it's destroyed in an instant. And so what you need to do is create opportunities for this trust to be earned while making sure that those situations where it gets destroyed don't happen. So when I was putting this deck together, I did have a placeholder image here of a nice close-up of a watering can watering a plant, and it was a nice, it kind of worked well with the keynote this morning, cultivating a person, in this case, cultivating a team environment. Couldn't find a good Creative Commons image, so this is a picture of my 3-year-old watering our tomatoes for the year. But I think the metaphor still holds. So imagine your team is this vegetable bed. Psychological safety is a nice bright red tomato, and you are a 3-year-old. Okay, so let's get stuck into it. So what can you do to cultivate psychological safety? First of all, be vulnerable. Lead by example. Be transparent about your own mistakes, your own failures. Make sure that you ask for feedback, that you talk openly about feedback, that you take things on board and show that you want to improve. This makes it clear to the people you're working with that it's okay to show some vulnerability. It's okay not to have all the answers. It's okay to need to improve. Make sure there are clear roles, clear structure. This allows people to hold each other to account in a consistent way. So you can do this by having clear role expectations, having team agreements, and using direct language with each other. Don't beat around the bush, don't soften things. Again, this is not about being nice, it's about being direct while caring. Again, that idea from radical candor. And think about, excuse me, think about what behaviors you tolerate. Culture is defined by the worst behaviors that you tolerate in your organization. And so make sure that you have really clear expectations about what behaviors are and are not tolerated. Build cohesive teams with strong interpersonal relationships. This is where team building activities, team bonding come into play. This also just happens over time when a team works closely together and kind of work together in good faith. I often say that one of the best team building activities you can do is just by doing the work together. Empower your employees to be involved in decision making. This gets them more buy-in. And set high standards to inspire and support and enable the team to meet these high standards. Emphasize a worthy purpose for your team. If people understand why their work matters, it'll help them overcome that interpersonal risk. It'll tilt the scales and make sure that the upside of speaking out very much outweighs the downside risk of maybe looking a bit stupid. Probably the most important thing is create a culture of listening. This enables voices to be heard. The inclusiveness talk yesterday mentioned mirroring, which is a really good example of an action you can do. So repeating what you hear, because that shows that you're actually listening to the person. It makes the person feel heard, and it actually means that you are listening. It means you are understanding what they say. Be approachable. Consider all advice or input or any concerns or feedback seriously. Make sure that you thank people when they give you feedback. It's very hard for people to speak up, especially to the boss, so they need to have a reason to do it. And so when they do, make sure that they feel it was worthwhile. And so this means making sure that you deal with it well, you thank them, you don't treat it in an unhealthy way. Signal an invitation to participate. Show humility, show proactive inquiry, ask questions and really listen to understand. Show genuine curiosity rather than just listening to respond and waiting for your turn to speak. You can create formal structures for input if that would make sense. Make sure there is a healthy reaction to vulnerability being shown. I just spoke about this a little bit. Instead of blame, give the benefit of the doubt. If something goes wrong, instead of first trying to root out who made the mistake and make an example of them, really try to understand what happened. Keep an open mind. And then work to improve the environment or the processes to reduce the likelihood of future mistakes or problems in that same area. So a really good example of a day-to-day practice here, so good suggestion by James the other day, was code reviews. Code reviews are a practice that many development teams have, and it might sound straightforward enough, but they can be a really good test bed of a team's culture. If there's no psychological safety, people might take criticism in a code review very personally. They might have a lot of ego attached to their work. Someone giving a review might be judgmental, might use absolute language, like you always make this mistake, or making assumptions about what the developer had in mind, what their intentions were. So instead, in a healthy environment, this would look very different. First of all, there would still be feedback. You wouldn't have the kind of toxic positivity of people kind of just waving things through because they don't want to have the argument. But you would have people being direct. You would maybe ask questions. Why did you do it this way? Show genuine curiosity rather than making assumptions about the way that someone did something. Give feedback about the code itself, not the person. And again, if you have an opinion about something, make it clear that it's your opinion rather than fact. So yeah, code review is a great microcosm of team culture overall. Make sure that it's safe to dig into failures. This way learning can take place. Now, there are different kinds of failures and they need to be dealt with in different ways. So in a complicated environment, we rely on best practices. And this helps us to avoid preventable failures. Things will still go wrong, and the appropriate response to that is to amend your best practices, keep them up to date. In a complex environment, though, which is a lot of work we do, things will just go wrong. There'll be a confluence of events that no one foresaw, and no individual could reasonably be blamed. And so in these instances, it's important to learn from them. Again, be open-minded, don't be judgmental, and just try to learn a lesson so that you can prevent that whole class of problem from coming up again. And then the third kind of failure is, so Amy Edmondson calls it intelligent failures. And you can think about this as if you run an experiment, and if it's a true experiment, you don't know whether it's going to succeed or fail. And failure is going to be a pretty likely outcome. And when that happens, you should celebrate it because you've learned something new. Negative data is still data. And very importantly, if you're trying to build psychological safety in a team, don't assume it's there. In particular, it can be very easy for a leader or a boss to take for granted that their own voice is always welcome. Everyone's always willing to listen to them, which can make it very easy to fail to appreciate how difficult it can be for others to speak up. So if you get that instinct of like, no, I'm pretty sure the team feels psychologically safe, I speak my mind all the time, don't trust that instinct. So cultivating psychological safety is very hard. It's something to be done over the long term, and it's never done. It's a continuous process of improvement. Okay, so if you're trying to build a psychologically safe environment, be cautious, because there are some good intentions that can backfire and accidentally reduce psychological safety. There is sometimes conflation of psychological safety with the idea of safe spaces, though in many ways they can be at odds, which is interesting because they do come from a very similar origin. But yes, there is a little bit of unfortunate overlap of the word safe here, which can cause confusion. Safe spaces were traditionally designed as a place for people to be free from physical harm, a place to be themselves. More recently, they've become more common on university campuses as a place for people to recuperate, to be comfortable. And in this latter example, they're intended to be a place free of conflict, of criticism, free of challenge. And while this can be useful and does have its place, it does not describe an environment where creative teamwork can flourish. And while it's important that you're not criticizing people for being themselves, you're not criticizing the person, the criticism of ideas must be allowed. Of course, if you do criticize people, that's how you end up with a culture of fear and blame, which we've talked about already. So if you want psychological safety, it can be dangerous to put too much emphasis on protecting people from discomfort. Psychological safety is safety from fear, safety from judgment, but not from discomfort or conflict. Discomfort is often a prerequisite for growth and learning. And conflict is required to contend with ideas and for the best ideas to win. And if people feel they need to walk on eggshells, well, that becomes another form of facade. And you end up again with an environment of not psychological safety because people just aren't able to be their true selves. So if your boss ever says, this is a safe environment to talk, it might be worth asking exactly what they mean. Now, I'm not saying safe spaces are bad or don't have their place. I'm really just saying with any kind of practice, make sure you really understand what the implications are going to be. Really think it out. Not just what the intentions are. Consider what the impact will be of any practice over the long term for the whole group and ensure that it will achieve something that's in line with your goals. Now, a diverse team can outperform a homogeneous team if they are able to embrace and resolve conflict while maintaining tight team bonds. Conflict should never be avoided. Again, this is how you end up with people not speaking up and a lack of psychological safety. So whenever conflict emerges, it should be resolved in a healthy way. And resolving conflict in a healthy way is another very big topic that I'm not going to go into. That could be its own talk. But not all conflict is desirable. And so while you don't want to avoid conflict, there are a lot of cases where you might want to prevent it from coming up at all. So I want to explore this with an example. I want to give you a question to reflect on. How deep is too deep when it comes to diversity? How different can your people be without it bringing more problems than benefits? Now, I imagine most people here would agree that it's desirable to bring diverse, conflicting ideas and solutions when problem solving in knowledge work. And I imagine most people would agree that it may even be desirable for to look for people who differ, have different approaches to their work, maybe even different ideas about what products you should be building. It may be desirable to look for people who differ a little bit from your culture, but that's something you should really think carefully about. If you hire for culture fit, which is quite common, this ignores the possibility that someone could add to or improve your culture. There was a good talk this morning that mentioned culture add. You should really be intentional about what culture you want and hire for that, whether it's exactly the same culture that you already have or whether you want to add and expand and change your culture. The answer to this depends on how core you feel your culture is to who you are as a studio, whether you feel it can grow and improve or whether it should. Yesterday's talk about building inclusive teams talked a fair bit about brilliant jerks. Should you tolerate brilliant jerks? So to a brilliant jerk, subject matter expert who's basically very stubborn and above all criticism. But if you have brilliant jerks in your organization, you're going to get a culture of fear. You'll end up with groupthink. People won't speak up. They'll be, it's exactly where you don't want to be. What about diversity of core values? Your bottom line principles and beliefs as a studio. Do you want to embrace or avoid people who conflict with that? Or maybe as long as everyone's obeying the law of the land, you want as much diversity of principles and beliefs as you can get your hands on. What are your studio's non-negotiables? What hill will you die on? Or to put it another way, at what level of depth does groupthink become desirable? I can't tell you the answer because it's going to differ for every person, every team, every studio, but it is worth thinking about. It's worth figuring out what that means for you and at least being mindful of it. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about measuring psychological safety. Luckily, there are tools to do this. We've already talked a bit about what an environment looks like when there is or is not psychological safety, and this is the key to measuring it, kind of observing your environment. So Amy Edmondson's research culminated in this measurement. It's 7 statements that you can agree or disagree to. I'm going to read them all because they're very important. If you make a mistake on this team, it's often held against you. Members of this team are able to bring up problems and tough issues. People on this team sometimes reject others for being different. It's safe to take a risk on this team. It's difficult to ask other members of the team for help. No one on the team would deliberately act in a way that undermines my efforts. And working with members of this team, my unique skills and talents are valued and utilized. So this is just on its own a useful survey you can ask members of your team just to give you a kind of finger in the wind of how they feel. A few of our teams have done this and they've found it very useful. They've identified some statements that don't really get agreed with as much as the others, or there are a couple that you want to disagree with, but and have taken actions to try to improve things. Now, there are some more approaches that are kind of feeding off of this research. Don't worry about the links. I'll post them on Twitter after this. But the first one here suggests asking each of these 7 questions twice, once for the person in the team that you're most comfortable with and least comfortable with. And that way you can distinguish between interpersonal and cultural issues. The second one is another questionnaire put out by Amy Edmondson, which is much more in depth. It also covers team learning behaviors and outcomes. And the third one details many specific team behaviors that can be identified and quantified to give an idea of psychological safety. So these are things like, is there a negative reaction towards new ideas, enthusiasm levels of the team, do people acknowledge mistakes, do people avoid confrontation, do they ask open questions, that kind of thing. So some of this research could probably be could be used to put some decent measurement tools together if anyone's interested in doing that. So that's it for the content. So I hope you now have a bit more of an understanding of what psychological safety is, why it's so important for effective creative teams, how it unleashes the potential in your diverse team, how to cultivate a psychologically safe culture in your teams and studios. And if you do want to go deeper into this topic, this is the book by Amy Edmondson, Fearless Organization. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's an excellent read, and it contains a lot of research, a lot of data. Thank you very much. Okay, so the microphone's going to be put down the middle, so if anyone has any questions, please come forward. If not, I can just keep talking. So.
Great talk. I had a question in regards to more on the lines of dealing with team, trying to build psychological safety when dealing with team members of geographical diversity. Like the thing I think about is like some like Asian cultures, for example, that aren't as like in their cultures, like being frank is like not really looked down upon, and like more being agreeable as opposed to like being honest and true, especially when you think about stuff like, healthy conflict and that kind of thing. How do you navigate that, trying to ensure that you've got like, a psychologically safe environment, but also respecting some of the limitations that some of your the diverse kind of workers have?
Yep. So I guess, first of all, to get an idea of what some of those cultural differences are, there's a great book by Erin Meyer called The Culture Map, which kind of goes through many different aspects of, I guess, behaviors that you'd see in a workplace, and kind of literally maps different cultures onto that, so you can see how they differ. And yeah, your frankness is a great example of that. So really, you need to make sure that your team does have basically a single cohesive culture, and depending on the people in that team, it, I guess, becomes a bit of a negotiation of what's appropriate. For some people, if it's very important to say defer to the boss or something like that, you might need to I guess create other avenues to get their input, maybe having one-on-ones and things like that. But yeah, really it comes down to the team overall agreeing on a set of kind of clear standards and behaviors so that they can hold themselves accountable. And that needs to be something that everyone in the team is comfortable with.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thanks for your talk, Dominic. Just some points that you mentioned for clarity and directness, super important, as you said. When it comes to wanting to create an openness and approachability with your team as a leader, do you have any recommendations for facilitating processes? So one good example for myself, I was previously in a position where I was being intimidated by a teammate, but that teammate had Christmas dinner with my boss and CEO, so there was no way for me to escalate that internally in my company. So any recommendations on like facilitating that?
Right. So I guess my general recommendation for any kind of interpersonal conflict is to try to address it directly with that person, and only escalate it if you have to. So if there are any ways of working directly with this person to change their behavior, and I guess the way to do that would be, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, go in with curiosity, go in giving the person the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they don't understand the impact of their actions, and so just letting them know what the impact was might help. If they're being if they're intentional about it and just being a jerk, then I guess you have to figure out, is that acceptable in your organization? And if it's if they're best friends with the boss or the CEO or whatever, then you need to figure out, is that something that you can overcome, or do you need to find somewhere else to work? Yep.
Sure. Thank you very much.
No great answers there, unfortunately.
No easy answer.
Hi, Dominic. Thanks for the great talk. With when you talk about the team, and you were looking at sort of taking on this for your studio, would you be looking at doing it at a studio level, or are we talking about teams? Is there a point where...
Do you mean the questionnaire?
Yeah, or even just like if there's a set of boundaries or something that you need to set, are you doing it in your sort of smaller strike teams, or are you trying to do it at an organizational or studio level?
Both. So basically I guess primarily I'm thinking about small teams of people, because creating psychological safety with a large group is almost impossible.
That's what I was sort of thinking, like the different teams, if you had 5 teams in your organization, they might have different dynamics that need different sets of boundaries or rules.
Yeah, and so I do try to encourage that. I encourage teams to have their own cultures, as long as they're not conflicting with the I guess the rules, the standards of the studio overall. But yeah, you'll find that the smaller the group, the easier it is to build trust, and the more trust there will be. In the same way, people generally have much more trust for their direct manager than they would for their manager's manager, or so on. So yeah, I would focus on any of these activities you try to do, focus at the team level first, because first of all, that's where you're going to see most of the benefit. That's where the work gets done. That's where it's really important that there is that psychological safety. And just because at a broader level, it's much, much harder.
Sounds a little less daunting.
Thank you very much for this. It was really useful. Just sort of following on that question as well, for small teams that are potentially in a position to encounter really rapid growth for a company, how do you maintain sort of existing standards without having to lose that? And I know it's sort of like a very broad question.
Sure. You need to be very deliberate about hiring. So I guess our studio we've made our mistakes. We went through an acquisition 10 years ago. We were Big World, and then we got acquired by Wargaming. And in the years after that, we grew from 15 to 20 people to about 100 over about 2 or 3 years. And a lot of our focus was on hiring for skill. We really had a lot of work we needed to do. We needed to focus on that. And so we got some very skilled people, but our culture was all over the place. And so at the studio leadership level was trying to kind of maintain the kind of small team culture that it had before, but we kind of didn't pay anywhere near as much attention as we should have when we were hiring. So yeah, when you're hiring and when you're growing, be very deliberate about the kind of culture you want for your studio, whether that's keeping it exactly the same or recognizing where it can grow and where it should evolve. But trying to find that when recruiting, find people who will fit in with that or who will augment it nicely. Basically, yeah, people who will take you in the direction that you want to go. It's very difficult to, again, when you're interviewing someone, it can be very difficult to figure out how they'll change their culture. So yeah, it's worth figuring out some questions you can ask that will give you an idea of how they'll approach situations, how they tend to behave, the kind of teams they like to work in, how they deal with conflict, all those kind of things.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was excellent.
Thanks.
It just sort of reminded me of just a little bit of recommendation. Maybe there's a book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and there was a chapter about why in South Korean Airlines their planes were crashing as often as they were. Do you
No, I haven't read
okay,
it,
so and it was and it was a bit of a national scandal, and they were doing a lot of soul searching and trying to figure out why they thought, was it a competency issue? Were they not training people enough? And what they found was that the relationship between pilot and co-pilot was seen as a relationship of a senior and a junior, and so the co-pilot didn't feel safe disagreeing with the pilot, and that led to fatal results. Mm-hmm. And there was also a similar situation when interacting between, I think it was like somewhere in Colombia and like US. Sorry, I've just gone blank. The people on the ground at the airport, they were not open enough. It was very very subtle language, and not Americans were used to really like straight up language, and so it's less about how they actually solved it, but in this particular case with South Korean Airlines, they ended up actually using English, like a subset of what they called like airline English,
Mhm.
so they had like 180 words, and it sort of gave them permission to talk in a way that broke through the
Right, they were forced to be more direct, and so that kind of
and
gave them permission
so
to.
anyway, so I just wanted to, because it just reminded me of that, and I think it's a really good book in general. But
Yeah.
that was a really nice, concrete chapter on
Okay.
that. What you're talking about. Yeah.
Thanks.
But thank you.
That's right. Yeah, a good example in Amy Edmondson's book that she talks about. So she started this research in healthcare because she found that there were huge discrepancies in the amount of errors that nurses were making, and a lot of this came down to just the relationship between nurses and doctors. There tends to be a lot of positional power there, and if there's not psychological safety, nurses don't want to speak up. So yeah, it can be very, very impactful.
Thank you.
Hi, again, wonderful talk. I was just wondering, like, as we're probably all aware, like, lack of psychological safety, toxic positivity groups, they're very insidious. And at least in my experience, I found that people on the ground floor notice it first.
Mm-hmm.
Would you have any tips for those people who are probably lowest in the power structure about how to point it out in a smart and reasonable way?
Right. So yeah,
Before it gets too bad.
if you have no positional power, how do you raise that to the people who have a lot of control over you, or a lot of influence over your your pay packet and all of that? If there is anyone, I guess, at a higher level that you can trust, speaking to them, depending on your organization, I would hope that in a lot of companies, the people at the top, the CEO and executives, do actually want what's best for people, and they do want problems to be raised. The problem may be kind of in middle management, and kind of bypassing that could help just to kind of open the eyes of executives to see that there is a problem. But I mean, someone at a lower level talking to an executive in a company is a very difficult thing to do as well. So yeah, that's a tricky one, because really, culture is very much top down, and so if you manage a small team, you have a lot of influence over the culture of your team, but it's very hard to expand that outwards. Yeah, there's no real great answer there. It's just find people you do trust or can be open with, or if there's a way to send something up the chain anonymously or something like that, find ways to do that.
Yeah, that's a completely reasonable answer. I was just wondering if you had a magic solution.
I don't, I'm sorry. Cool, I think we're out of time now, so thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.